Hello again and welcome. We have a special guest with us today. It's Charles Oppenheimer, and we're going to be talking about nuclear energy and its how it's evolved, its reputation, looking to the future a little bit. So, welcome, Charles. Very good to have you.
Thank you, Fridrik.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
So, I have a set of questions I want to go through and just see you aren't prepared for them. So, we'll see how spontaneous you are in going through them. So, and they are mostly around the image of nuclear and the perception of nuclear, which you and I have talked about at length and pondered on and where it's headed, etc. So, but if I were to ask you, how has the conversation around nuclear energy changed in the past, let's say, 3 decades?
Yeah. Um, well, 3 decades ago was maybe an arbitrary time, but if you took it all the way back to the beginning, we could quickly spin through it. So 1950s was the first time that you had the projection that the scientists thought would happen is that you could generate nuclear energy from fission. Before that, it was only weapons. And in the 1950s, the science and the experiments moved quite rapidly into actually producing nuclear energy. And by the 1960s, it was a commercial product that was used. And that was probably the high point of the perception of it. The assumption by many people was that there would be a widespread, massive amount of nuclear energy, both in the 1950s and the 1960s, which is interesting because that is right around the time that the fear and the understanding of how serious and terrible nuclear weapons and a nuclear arms race was peaking. So right at the same time that fear and finally a backlash and a popular reaction against nuclear arms was really picking up speed in the 1960s, perception and the implementation of nuclear energy was just starting, and it was a popular thing. It was considered an environmental attribute, especially by people in California who were worried about smog and air pollution. CO2 was not a concern at that time, but they saw nuclear energy as a potential solution. And just globally, that was a huge expansion of moving something that was scientifically possible into commercial reality. And that sweet spot, that honeymoon time, didn't last very long. It was very much bookended by a very specific time of 1979, where right at the same point of 3 Mile Island, the first major nuclear meltdown reactor plant that had been forecast that could happen, happened at the exact same time a Hollywood movie was released. 12 days before, a Hollywood movie, The China Syndrome, was released, which was a horror story about nuclear energy. And those two events, if you release a horror story, a shocking fictional story, and 12 days later in real life, something that sounds like such a horror story was happening in the news story, it created probably with finally the intersection of a real popular backlash against nuclear weapons, of a real widespread dislike of nuclear energy, undeniable popular opinion where everybody believed it was terribly unsafe and a terrible thing and almost the same as nuclear weapons. And the only ironic part of that is that 3 Mile Island incident did not kill or injure anybody, and it actually didn't even release very much, almost any measurable radiation. So it's pretty shocking to say this unbelievable disaster that everybody knows in their mind and their perception how terrible it was equivalent to a meltdown of your engine in a truck. That doesn't hurt anybody. The engine's damaged, but there's no big deal. That's exactly what the first nuclear disaster was an industrial accident that couldn't have been safer. So that's the first part. Second part, I would say, is the slow downfall of nuclear energy, especially on the business sense, where businesses stopped buying it. Up to that point in the 1980s, there was a lot of purchasing of nuclear energy, both by state governments and by large utilities in the US. And they started feeling it was too expensive and increasing cost and public backlash. And finally, we have this new era starting, I'd say, in the mid 2010s and 20s, where nuclear energy has now been accepted by the left environmental side, joining the kind of right side, and there's a huge appreciation for it. It's the only bipartisan issue effectively in climate and energy science. It's supported by Republicans and Democrats in the US, which is an amazing thing. It's recognized across business leaders and tech leaders and globally as something that we need. And so that's a maybe not so brief history of the perception of nuclear energy.
No, thanks. It was thanks for the clarification. You answered it, within what you just said. But I want to ask you, but if you give me a very brief answer to it. So, if you think about the past, just what are the biggest misconceptions that still linger in the public dialogue today? Like very short and concise.
Sure. The biggest one is the danger. So the popular perception is that nuclear energy is dangerous, and the measurable reality is it's not dangerous. It's measurable. It's not an opinion. It's a scientific fact that it's not it could be dangerous, but the way we've managed it for 80 years is proven to be safe. You could have almost no safer version. And right behind that is that the waste or the spent fuel that comes from nuclear energy is this unsolvable problem. It's dangerous, it's terrible, and it's a problem. And it's actually not a problem. The spent fuel from nuclear energy is not a problem at all. It's more or less a battery or a resource. So those are the two major misconceptions. Shockingly opposite of the public perception. I mean, I'm saying that the perception is it's safe, it's dangerous, and the reality is it's safe. It's just completely 160 off from the popular perception. I say that unapologetically as somebody who didn't used to support nuclear energy, took a deep look at it and found that the reality is actually the opposite of its perception.
Interesting. Yeah. It makes me reflect on what is perception, what is reality in real life. It can't be far off. But if you talk about the current reputation, of course, it's colored by what you just said. But if you were to just in a short sentence, where do you think public perception of nuclear energy stands right now, globally on the one hand, and in North America on the other hand?
So globally, it's shifted towards slightly more positive, over 50% positive. And in North America, it's over 60% positive, coming from a place of, say, mid 30s% approval. So a huge shift. And so it's globally shifted. And that's just in public perception. Most of the people who were against it don't have a deep knowledge. They just perceive it as a dangerous, bad thing. And what's happened consistently is more and more people take a look at it. Once you take a look at it, you say, oh, it's actually not a dangerous, bad thing. It's very interesting.
So this is interesting. But what about the younger versus the older generations? Their perception, is there a big difference?
It's incredible dividing line. The younger people that you talk to, let's say maybe more in North America, I'm most familiar with, is they don't even understand this 3 Mile Island thing. They don't even have a perception of, oh, it's terrible and it's dangerous. They didn't hear that on the news for 20 years. So for them, it's not a starting point of saying this is bad. So it's very clear, and the staunch, never ending anti-nuclear energy sentiment is very old. It's like 80s years old, 70s and 80s, and they're never going to change them. They're going to move on to other places, but they're not going to change their mind. So it's very, very clear dividing line.
Interesting. But if you think about, there some people oppose it on general principle, or some people are opposed because they're scared. Some people, talk positively about it for whatever reasons. But if you think about which voices have been most influential in changing the narrative in recent years, both towards the positive and the negatives.
Yeah. I would say the voices that have been influential in changing narrative, I would give a shout out to the nuclear energy advocates. So unfortunately, it was not the industry itself. The nuclear energy industry is very defensive. They always have been, for understandable reasons. You get beat up and punched in the face enough, you're going to get defensive. And that industry has been attacked constantly, popularly, through regulations, through other people, and they're extremely scared and defensive. That's the history of nuclear energy industry. And when they tried to advocate for themselves, they would do things like say, hey, we'll make this even safer, and we'll make it safer and safer and safer and safer, when it wasn't actually dangerous in the first place. So they weren't able to kind of make their own case, even though if you go talk to them, the engineers and scientists know it's been a safely well-managed thing that people should have. But the people who did make a difference is the young advocates, and I'll call out some names: Isabel Boemke, Ryan Pickering, Mark Nelson, Chris Kiefer. These are people that's the tip of the iceberg. Who Rachel Pritzker, I guess she's not an advocate, but there's so many people, Ted Nordhaus, who came into the nuclear energy industry from the outside, looked at it, had the kind of realization that I did, and said, not only is this so wrong, I have to tell people it's wrong. And often, very often, they came from the left or environmental view. And they said, if I'm not opposing this for environmental reasons, you should hear about it's actually not dangerous. And it radicalizes people when you see that your perception was so far off. That's what happened to me. I kind of thought it was kind of interesting, but it was probably a bad thing. And when I realized that everything I knew about it was wrong, then you kind of fall down into the rabbit hole. So I think the opportunity for brands and companies is to take advantage of that, and don't be apologetic and lean into it. And you can confidently say, there's difficult parts of it. It could be a dangerous thing and there's a bad perception, but instead of shying away from it, add more information, add the science part, repeat the very boring parts of nuclear safety that take 5 hours to understand over and over and over, and just really lean into it. And the top two nuclear utility brands in the US, Constellation and Vistra, have, they try to do that, but they're still public companies and they're big and it's risky for them. So the advocates have made a huge difference.
Well, we've talked about, the evolution, we talked about the current state. And if you look to the future now and still keeping public perceptions in mind. So I know you don't have a, crystal ball to read into the future, but where will the perception of nuclear energy be in 20 years' time?
So, there's many different parts of perception. The political perception in the US has shifted. It's just 100% measurably shifted. So in the House and Representative and Senate of the US, they had a vote, the most recent nuclear vote. It was 88-2. There was no opposition. Everybody was in favor as politicians. So that's a landslide. Not every person in the United States is that same level, and it's much more complicated to then go start a project, because you could have 1,000 people for it and one person against it, and that one person will have a huge effect. So it's generally politically and public support good enough already. And the big question about the future of nuclear energy is, does it work practically? Are we going to do it? It's not just the perception part. The perception part of the safety is one thing, but do we get the project done? Did we plan a project and people invested in it and then it came online and everybody used it? If we did this at the right scale for the Earth, it could be the solution effectively to climate change, the most important part, a massive expansion of nuclear energy. But that we're very, very far off. We're very far off even one project being started in the US. There's just glimmers of ideas of projects, but it's very hard to move that into reality of implementation of actual nuclear energy projects that have any chance of replacing the amount of fossil fuels we have in the system. So it needs to go from this politically supportable enough to real practical expansion. And if you ask me where I think the future is, it will be in that latter part, that for the next 20 years, we'll get further and further down the path of implementing it. But 20 years is a drop in the bucket. We'll be we're 80% plus fossil fuels on primary energy system, total energy in the world. And so where are we going to be 20, 30 years from now? We'll probably be down to 70% fossil fuels or 60. I mean, there couldn't ever be enough expansion of this energy source to kind of help our especially energy abundance and climate goals.
Interesting. Thanks for looking 20 years into the future. But if you think 10 years, just 10 years, and think about reputation, which milestones or major developments could impact the reputation in the next decade?
So that's a great milestone, because the exact measurement, if you started a project to build a nuclear project today, you could reasonably expect to get it finished in 10 years. Not 20 years, not 50 years. 10 years is a time frame where you really could bring on from today new nuclear energy. Most of the startups do this kind of selling thing of saying, oh, it'll be a couple years, and 3 years you have to do that as a startup. That's effectively impossible. 10 years is achievable. So that's a great milestone. I say that in 10 years from now in the United States, we will be able to measure up to 6 to 10 gigawatts of new nuclear energy. And that's in a sense a pitiful amount compared to the amount we need. But I think some of the projects, maybe you'll have many start and then you'll get enough done and through the pipeline that by 2035 we have that order of it. The US projection from the Department of Energy is 35 gigawatts by 2035. And I said only 6 gigawatts, and the Trump administration will probably see some news today or in the next couple of days that say we need 400 new gigawatts. And, not necessarily by 2035, but we'll see where we come out in that spectrum. But I think we will actually see projects online. The Chinese are the best at implementing this. They actually will have over 100 gigawatts of new nuclear, not by 2035, but in total coming online. So,
thank you. So we're almost done. But if you just so we looked into the how these have been evolving today and to the future. But the next part, I want to talk about the Charles audience, and people that attend Charles, that listen to our podcasts, and they're part of our society or our network of people. So if you think about them, which narratives or messages do you think resonate the best with skeptical audiences?
Well, I mean, I guess ask yourself this: do you have to worry about skeptical audiences? What's your goal of the Charge audience? The Charge. Your constituents worry about the branding of energy. Like, how are we perceived as an energy company? And I think I laid it out before, and I say this: I am unapologetic about nuclear energy. I say I don't dance around and say maybe it's unsafe. It's just measurably safe. It's measurably good. You have the young energy. You have the advocates in the space saying that. Take advantage of that energy and just, that consensus, this moving consensus, and say we are doing this. We are the type of brand who are implementing nuclear energy. We're for it. We're making it happen. Don't make any apologies about, I need to convince every single person in the world. So that is what the opportunity is. Take advantage of this growing global consensus that almost everybody's behind. 30 of the countries in the world have already agreed to triple nuclear energy. It's already been decided politically. So for branders, lean into it, use it, don't apologize for it, and skate to where the puck is going.
Yeah. As a quick follow-up to this one, do you see any common mistakes that people like nuclear advocates are doing when they talk to the public or the policymakers?
Well, I guess there's different camps in the tactics of nuclear energy. So the advocates can, I'm basically representing an advocate type view on this call, where it says just do it and it's great. But there's a lot of people in the nuclear energy industry who don't feel free to do that. They have very serious problems, policy and political problems, and they deal with all that a little quieter. And the business problems are serious. These are big billion-dollar things, and they're hard to. So, those groups are not wrong. Those who look after policy and politics, those who look after investment, need to take things very seriously, not always be talking publicly. And the advocates have a role, and maybe advertisers and branders, of talking about things publicly. So it's just, there's different perspectives that are valid in the industry.
Great answers, man. So my last question, the very last question. So what we talk about at Charles is how do we change energy's reputation, not just nuclear, but as a whole. And you have the sexy startups doing green stuff, and then you have the more traditional oil and gas or traditional things of producing energy or selling it. So what piece of advice can you give to communicators who are trying to reshape energy's reputation?
Well, I have one thought that boring is sexy. So the part of energy grids and the use of it is such a boring thing for people. I toured a nuclear plant just 2 days ago in Slovenia, and the most the exciting thing is how they talk about how their safety record, nothing's happened in 18 months. And you go into a control room and nothing's happening. It just sits there and it runs and it produces energy. And you can look at that in it. I think a lot of consumers have this idea of anytime I receive a problem with my energy, it's off, I'm so mad at the power company, and is kind of an antagonistic view towards those who produce energy. I think we're on the tip of viewing the energy we receive as consumers of it as a miracle. It's amazing how much it affects our life. And if we didn't have that, how terrible life would be. Just a little vignette. I got to our Airbnb here in Corsica last night and the power was out. There was a storm on the boat over and it knocked out the whole neighborhood. And we got to this Airbnb house and we were panicked. Are we going to leave? Do we have to go to a hotel? I grew up in the wilderness. I don't mind camping. Well, let's camp out inside. But it was still so much that you feel just being in a house without electricity. Nothing works. The shutters didn't work. Can't have any food. You can't have any coffee in the morning. And then, luckily it started again. So I think that there's a new age of appreciation around energy abundance and the value of producing energy. And that word is getting out in the world, and that branders and marketers should also kind of take advantage of that idea, that the idea of energy abundance at a certain level can solve all the world's problems. That should be the message to everybody. And that the problem is that there's places in the world where people don't have enough energy and effectively the wealth that goes along with it.
Yeah, wonderful. Energy is a miracle and boring is sexy. That's what I heard you say also.
That's right.
That's great. Thanks a lot. But just any last comments before we part?
What else do we have to say? No, that's great. I'm glad I could join you remotely, if not in person, and do what we can.
Yeah. We'll meet in person, at the Charles audience later. But this is great, and thanks for taking the time. I know this has been a really busy day, and on top of your uncertainties with losing energy this morning. And
we got it back midday. Yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Charles. And best of luck with everything, and see you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Fridrik.